and when should you introduce your novel's secondary characters? My name is Nina Ellis, Dr. Nina Ellis, and I'm an assistant professor of creative writing, English, and comparative literature here at a university in Egypt. This semester, I'm teaching a course in which my students will draft a 60,000 word novel over 4 months. And these videos are your opportunity to follow along with us. This is class 4, so make sure you've watched classes 1, 2, and 3 before watching this one, or it might not make sense. As those of you who've been following along will know, we're using The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald as our guide novel for this course, leading us through how to structure a novel. And one of the many clever things that Fitzgerald does in this novel is that he chooses to introduce his secondary characters before he introduces his main character. So think of it this way. You have one main character in The Great Gatsby, that is Gatsby. Arguably, you have a second main character, a second protagonist, the narrator, Nick Carraway, although he insists that it's not really his story that he's telling, it's Gatsby's. So the narrator, Nick Carraway, and Gatsby, who we're calling character A, the protagonist. We meet the narrator right away, and he gives us his family history, as we discussed in classes 2 and 3. And he briefly mentions the protagonist, Gatsby, but he doesn't go into detail about him or describe how they met. After this first hint at the main protagonist, Gatsby, in the opening pages, the narrator, Nick Carraway, goes off and introduces all the other secondary characters. That is, Nick's cousin, Daisy Buchanan, who we're calling character B, her husband, Tom Buchanan, who we're calling character C, and Jordan Baker, who's going to be a love interest / ally for Nick Carraway. By introducing these characters before he introduces the titular character of the book, Gatsby, Fitzgerald builds tension. He's planted the seed of mystery by mentioning Gatsby in the opening pages, and now he builds that tension, that mystery, that suspense by forcing his readers to wait to meet Gatsby in the flesh. And I suggest that we do that with our novels too. Introduce our secondary characters before we introduce our main protagonist. I should specify that I really think a novel should only have about 6 characters. You can have additional people in there, of course, but I really think that a short novel like this, a 60,000 word draft, can only hold about 6 fully fleshed out characters. So you have the narrator, N, the protagonist, character A, and then the secondary characters B, C, D, and then E, who we'll talk about in a future class. In the draft you've written so far, you've introduced the narrator, as I said, you've mentioned character A, and now today we're going to work on writing the next 4,000 words, which I realize is quite a lot. And over those 4,000 words, you're going to introduce his characters B, C, and D, following Fitzgerald's model. So the first thing to do is to read the relevant pages of The Great Gatsby. In my version, that's pages 8 to 22, most of chapter 1. We're starting off with the section we ended with last time, which finishes off "Life was beginning over again with the summer." Go ahead and label the following sections like this. So, for the next page, you have a setting description of where the narrator lives. And you will go ahead and do that for your narrator too. So it begins, "There was so much to read for one thing and so much fine health to be pulled down out of the young breath-giving air." It goes on to describe the setting of Nick Carraway's house and the difference between West Egg and East Egg, which is the context for the house that he lives in. Then he goes on to introduce characters B and C as respectively his cousin Daisy, character B, and her husband, Tom, character C, whom he knew at college. They live nearby, which is why it's relevant to bring them up here after a setting description. So you can go ahead and introduce characters B and C, who your narrator should have known in the past but not have seen in a while at this point. They don't have to be a couple, as they are in The Great Gatsby, but they need to be some kind of pair. They could be siblings or friends or business partners. For about half a page, Fitzgerald describes them and talks about how they ended up settling in this place where the narrator now lives. And there's a really important sentence in this section, which goes, "The history of the summer really begins on the evening I drove over there to have dinner with the Tom Buchanans." This marks the beginning of the action of the novel. We've had the exposition, the history of the narrator's life, and this is where events really start to unfold in the story of Daisy, Tom, all these other secondary characters, and most importantly, Gatsby. So use a sentence like that to signal that the events of your novel are beginning at this point too. Then, for most of the rest of the chapter, we have a description of Nick Carraway, the narrator, N's visit to see Daisy and Tom at their house. In your novel, you should also have your character N, your narrator, visit characters B and C. It doesn't have to be at their house, though. It can be wherever makes sense to you. In Fitzgerald's version, here's how many pages this takes up.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 pages.
You should describe your narrator's visit to characters B and C in as much detail, and here are some other things to include in that section. So there should be a description of the setting in which the narrator meets characters B and C. It doesn't have to be their home, but wherever it is, you should describe it. In my version, that's the equivalent of what you find on page 10. And so it happened that on a warm, windy evening, I drove over to East Egg to see two old friends whom I scarcely knew at all. Their house was even more elaborate than I expected, a cheerful red and white Georgian colonial mansion, etc., for the rest of the paragraph. Then I think it's also quite effective to include a section on how characters B and C have changed since the narrator last saw them, because remember, these are people the narrator has known for a long time but not seen in a while. Fitzgerald really only does this for Tom Buchanan. Nick Carraway observes, he, Tom Buchanan, had changed since his New Haven years. Now he was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. And again, this goes on for about a paragraph. But I think in your version, you could do the same for character B. Explain to us how characters B and C have both changed since the narrator N last saw them. Another thing to include in this section is the introduction of character D, who is more minor than characters B or C, truly a secondary character, but who will act as an important ally for character N and is going to be the means by which character N ends up meeting character A, the protagonist. So here, that's Jordan Baker, at the bottom of page 11 in my version. The younger of the two women was a stranger to me. She was extended full length at her end of the divan, completely motionless, and with her chin raised a little as if she were balancing something on the end of it. So go ahead and introduce character D there too, as an ally for N. Other things to include in your visit from character N to characters B and C are a mention of character A's name, potentially. You don't have to include this, but it can help to build the mystery. So for example, on page 14 in my version, I don't know a single. You must know Gatsby. Gatsby? Demanded Daisy. What Gatsby? So we have this hint that she used to know him in the past, which is quite clever. And then the visit ends nearly at the end of chapter 1 with the paragraph beginning, of course I knew what they were referring to, but I wasn't even vaguely engaged. And we're going to stop just before the paragraph in which Nick Carraway drives home. I was confused and a little disgusted as I drove away. So after you label those sections, your work over the weekend, and I realize this is a big ask, is to write 4,000 words by hand. And in those 4,000 words, you need to include all the elements that you've just labeled in Fitzgerald's text. You have the setting description of where the narrator lives now. You have the narrator's introduction of characters B and C and who they are before they actually appear physically in the events of the text. You have a sentence signaling that this is where the action of the novel begins. You have a description of the setting where the narrator, character N, is going to meet characters B and C. You have a description of how characters B and C have both changed since the narrator last saw them. You have the introduction of character D. You have a mention of character A, the protagonist, which builds mystery. And then you have a long description of the meeting between character N and characters B and C, at which character D can also be present, if that makes sense, in the sequence of events of your novel. And I will check in with you again for class 5. Good luck with the writing. You can do it. I'm doing 1,000 words a day, which takes me about an hour. If I can do it, you can absolutely do it too. Don't be a perfectionist and do it by hand so that you can't cross things out. And of course, feel free to follow me on social media, Substack, blah, 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 blah. Bye.